This happened to me back in the 8th grade. Probably halfway through the school year, I received a phone call from an unknown caller. Usually, I would not answer for a number I didn't recognize, or sometimes I would do so in an accent, but I would always hang up after a second or two. Things changed, however, when the second I answered, I heard a man say my full name in a questioning tone, like if he was asking for confirmation that this was me. Being just a kid and thinking this was one of my parents' friends or someone who I could talk to, I told him that that was me. This turned out to be a big mistake, but I didn't know that at the time. I don't remember much of the first phone call, except that he hung up not long after I said that it was me. Some time passed, maybe less than a week, when I got an unknown call again. I didn't answer, and then I kept getting spam calls. So I finally answered, and this guy was asking me about what kind of TV shows I like to watch. I had gotten the idea that maybe I shouldn't be talking to this guy, so I just hung up. Not much longer, and another couple calls came in until I told him to stop calling me, and he responded saying that it was rude to hang up mid-conversation. My dad heard me and asked who I was talking to, so I told him that I didn't know and handed him the phone. My dad asked who it was and told him to stop calling my number in his angry dad tone. Then he got a confused face for a second before getting really angry and shouting at them before they abruptly hung up. My dad later told me that this person knew my father's name, John, and had told him, "Don't be so angry," before hanging up. Pretty soon, these calls would happen at least once a day, and I would almost always hand the phone to my dad for him to yell at the guy. We told all our friends and family to stop if they were prank calling me. We tried getting police involved, and we also contacted my middle school saying there was a guy being creepy with me. The guy never called during school hours, and he usually would call at first when I was home alone, but soon switched it up to calling around the time my father got home from work. The guy sounded young. For a long time, we thought my uncles or their friends were playing pranks on us. He sounded maybe mid to late 20s and sort of sounded Spanish. He never had an angry tone and never said anything malicious, but he was a stalker, and he knew the names of my parents, my sister, my dogs, some cousins, and my grandparents. He never called when he had company over, and it was never after like 8 p.m. At one point, I was sitting in my room and got a call. By this point, it was nearing the last few weeks of school, and because this guy never said anything bad, and police said there was nothing to do, I just answered the phone and asked what he wanted. I clearly remember he was listing off video games: Red Dead Redemption, Modern Warfare 2, Halo 3, among others. I looked at my disc stand and saw he was reading off the list in order that my games were, top to bottom. I stood up and looked out the window, but nobody was there. After the list was done, I just stood there, and he told me something about me having good taste in games and that we should play sometime. At this point, I was scared out of my mind. I cried and called my dad. He came home early and we realized, like idiots, that we could just change my number. We changed my number and I purged my Facebook account, and we all set our accounts to private. 6 months later, we moved, and after changing the number, I never got any calls from this guy. Recently, however, I have been getting unknown numbers calling me for the past couple of days. I never answer them anymore, but I am soon going to be changing my phone number once again. This happened to me about 2 years ago. I lived in a pretty quiet part of my city, in a small 2-bedroom basement apartment with my roommate who was gone for the summer. I stayed there and worked during the summer. I didn't get out all that often, and didn't know many people as I had moved to the area 2 years prior to this. One Sunday night, I was doing my usual gaming with some friends I had met on the internet, good friends of mine that I had known since I was 16, when suddenly I got this call from a private number. Now, I rarely got phone calls from people I knew. Normally, communication was done by just text messaging. So I picked up, and what sounded like a man, maybe in his early to mid 40s, picked up the phone. I asked him who it was, and he said his name was Robert, and I told him that I was sorry but he had the wrong number, and I hung up. About 10 minutes later, he called me again, and I thought to myself that maybe he accidentally dialed the wrong number again, so I ignored it and thought nothing of it. I continued to play video games with my friends, and it must have been about 9 or 9:30 p.m. by this time. Around 10 p.m. I got the call again, but I didn't pick up. About an hour and a half passed by, and it must have been about 11 p.m. by then. I got the call once again, and this time I answered, and literally the call went the exact same way as before, except I think this time I ended up saying too much. I told the guy once again that I was sorry and that he had the wrong number, that I didn't know anybody by the name of Robert. He told me, "Well then, I guess I'm going to stop by, and I think you'll get a pretty good idea of who I am when I'm done with you." At this point, I was instantly freaked out, and I just hung up. I was getting kinda scared, but I got a grip on myself and just figured that he must have beef with someone and really doesn't get that he was calling the wrong number. A few minutes later, I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway since I lived in the basement. There was a window facing the driveway, and I saw his headlights were shining right in. I lived in a triplex, and I figured it was my neighbor coming home from his night shift at the hospital. A few minutes passed by and the lights were still on. Quickly, it all came flooding back into my mind. It's him, I thought, and my stomach began to knot and I felt so afraid. My hands began to tremble. I peeked through the curtains and watched the car for quite some time. I couldn't tell if there was anyone inside or not since the headlights were bright. He didn't leave, so I called my brother who lived not far from me. I told him what happened and he told me to stay in the house, keep the door locked, and that he was coming to get me. Now my brother is a pretty intimidating guy if you've never met him before. He's about 6'4" with broad shoulders and a big beard. He came over and I let him in. He told me that there was nobody in the car, but the headlights were still on. I packed up some things and we headed off. He was kind enough to let me stay at his place for a few days until I felt okay. A few days later, upon returning to my apartment, the same vehicle was in the driveway. I started freaking out, but there was nobody in the car. I noticed blankets on all the seats. For some reason, I looked in the opposite direction, right at my garbage bin, and it was labeled. It had the words, "It's me," written on it. I quickly went into my apartment and locked the door and took a shower. When I got out, the car was gone. I did end up calling the police, and I do also want to mention that a murder previously had occurred in my apartment. I did go back to my brother's for the weekend and came back home for Sunday night. Things were okay for the most part, and I slept perfectly fine with little to no anxiety. I never heard from or saw that car again, but till this day, I still wonder who or what that guy wanted.